Chapter 4. Between the Wars, 1926 to 1938. In April 1926, Kenneth started on the long navigation course at HMS Dryad, the first of his 3 spells at that establishment, in those days centred in the navigation school in the dockyard at Portsmouth. The course included a survey of Loch Crinan, conducted from Dryad's tender, HMS Alresford, a World War I ex-minesweeper, though only commissioned in 1919, and immediately put into service as one of Dryad's 3 tenders at that time. The course appears from the photos to have been a pleasant and leisurely affair, the work with theodolites being accompanied by much standing around and pipe smoking. A boat's crew of seamen were on hand to row the course members about the loch to the various reference points. A whaler appears in some of the photos. It always seemed to me oddly inefficient that a naval whaler required 5 oarsmen, 3 on one side and 2 on the other. It must be relevant to manning a harpoon. On finishing the course, Kenneth trooped out to the Far East, the China Station as it was called in those days, in the old 4-funnelled cruiser HMS Dartmouth. His appointment was as navigator of another World War I ex-minesweeper, the coal-burning Petersfield, designated as tender to the cruiser Hawkins, built in 1917, which carried the flag of the Commander-in-Chief, China Station. The Petersfield carried 4 officers, some 60 other ranks, and 5 Chinese messmen and cooks. She was regarded as the C&C's personal yacht, and carried Admiral Tyrwhitt and sometimes his family on cruises to different parts of his enormous command. Among the places Kenneth visited during this time were Hong Kong, Shanghai, Canton, Fuzhou, Taipo, Fangling, Tianjin, Peking, Weihai, Hankow and Tangkou, as well as the Great Wall of China, the Yichang Gorges, and Seoul in Korea. Although there was civil war in China, Petersfield rarely seemed to be near to it. There are some photos of the ship cleared for action, with sandbags along the rail, used just as hammocks were in Nelson's day, and sailors in the prone position on deck armed with rifles. There are also a couple of pictures of the Nationalists' armoured train. Perhaps the general atmosphere was much as described in Thomas Woodruff's book, River of Golden Sand, a fictional account of a cruise up the Yangtze aboard one of the Navy's river gunboats a few years earlier, just after World War I. Thomas Woodruff must have experienced life on the China Station. His naval language and description of navigating the river are clearly authentic, though the patronizing, imperialistic attitude to the Chinese is embarrassing to the modern reader. Kenneth's albums record flag-waving events like Trooping the Colour in Shanghai on the King's birthday, 1927, as well as social occasions such as shipboard parties and picnics with the Admiral's family. Lady T and daughter Bobby feature in several photos. Kenneth seems to have played a fair amount of hockey, Navy versus Army in Shanghai, and combined services versus Waseda University, and occasional cricket. He also featured as the only officer in the Petersfield's football team, alongside 2 leading telegraphists, a signalman, 5 able seamen, and 2 stokers. The Petersfield, though not a river gunboat, was probably quite suitable for the Yangtze and other river and inshore work. However, Kenneth used to tell the family that he had predicted that it would capsize if it ever got caught in a typhoon off the China coast. In fact, a year or 2 after he had left the ship, in November 1931, it did sink, with the Commander-in-Chief's wife on board. There was no typhoon and no casualties, but the ship was a total loss. The most important event for Kenneth on this commission was not to do with the ship or the Admiral, but was his meeting with his future wife, Winifred Mary Molly Carruthers, aged 19 or so, the elder daughter of Samuel Dixon Carruthers, known as Dickon or Dick, and Winifred Ellen Allen. Mr. Carruthers was senior civil engineer at the Naval Dockyard, and the family, including Molly's sister Joyce, were living at number 5, The Peak. On return to England, and after less than a month in the cruiser Carlisle for navigation trials, Kenneth was posted as a navigator to HMS Adamant, a submarine depot ship. Kenneth and Molly were married on the 20th of April 1929 at All Souls, Langham Place. A year later, on the 28th of April 1930, Kenneth went back to HMS Dryad for the Advanced Navigation course. In July 1930, Kenneth was appointed to HMS Erebus for instruction of special entry cadets. These were officer cadets who had come from public schools and who had therefore missed the early naval training of Dartmouth. The Erebus was a monitor, one of a small number of ships built during World War I, 1915-1916, to provide heavy gun support in shallow waters. Erebus was about the size of a small cruiser, but carried two 15-inch guns of the type carried by the latest battleships in 1915. Her draft, depth below the water, was only about 11 foot, compared with some 30 foot for those battleships. In 1930, Erebus had been partially demilitarized for gunnery training purposes, and photographs from that period show a large classroom built under the barrels of the main armament. I was born on the 14th of October 1930 in a maternity home at 80 Croydon Road, Beckenham. Molly had temporarily gone home to her parents at 2 Elm Road, Beckenham. Kenneth was stationed at Davenport, where I was christened aboard the Erebus on the 25th of January 1931, the day before Kenneth's 29th birthday. In August 1931, Kenneth went back to Dryad as an instructor and remained there in various roles until December 1932. The only mention of him in Admiral Scurfield's The Story of HMS Dryad relates to this period. Apparently, Kenneth recommended a certain Chief Petty Officer Bunce for the post of Chief Quartermaster at the Navigation School, when the post unexpectedly became vacant. "From the moment he joined, we knew we had the right man," wrote Scurfield. Bunce retired in 1967. On the 15th of June 1931, 8 years to the day from his promotion to lieutenant, Kenneth was promoted to Lieutenant Commander. The 2.5 gold stripes of this rank originally denoted a lieutenant of over 8 years' seniority. In other words, promotion to that rank was solely on time served. Promotion to lieutenant was by examination, and further ranks beyond 2.5 were by selection within a fixed zone of seniority. Failure to be promoted to commander within this window resulted in becoming passed over and destined for early retirement. During this period, my sister Jane was born in a nursing home at 11 Cavendish Road, Southsea. For a few weeks early in 1933, Kenneth was posted to HMS Iron Duke, Admiral Jellicoe's old flagship at the Battle of Jutland, for temporary end duties, but then on the 7th of February came his appointment to the aircraft carrier Eagle for trials and passage to China. This must have been a wonderful job for Kenneth, but traumatic for Molly, who was about 4 months pregnant and facing a 2-year absence of Kenneth on the other side of the world. Jane was born in Southsea, nearby at 28 Victoria Road North, on the 2nd of July 1933. In the meantime, I had been sent back to Beckenham to Molly's parents. The earliest clear memory that I retain is of being ushered into the back bedroom at 2 Elm Road for my first sight of Jane when she and Molly came home. Report has it that I was not impressed and fled from the room, with an image of the room, the cot, and the door indelibly imprinted in my brain to this day. Living with her parents and separated from Kenneth for so long and by so much distance, and with the demands of a new baby, albeit with the domestic help usual in middle-class families in those days, this must have been a difficult time for Molly. I dimly remember it as a time when sometimes she took me out for a walk in the early mornings, along the red brick pavements of that part of Beckenham, eating apples. I used to think it was for my health and our exercise, but very late in her life she told me that it was a time of great emotional turmoil, when she fell in love with one of Kenneth's older colleagues, who showed an interest in her. Nothing came of this thanks to her strong sense of duty and loyalty to Kenneth. Only her mother, sister, and sister-in-law Violet knew about her stress at the time, and I suspect there would have been terrible consequences if her father, with his Northern Irish Presbyterianism, had found out. I believe it put a damper on our parents' relationship for several years. Mother never revealed the name of her admirer. During this time I started at kindergarten, a house called Woodbrook in Beckenham. I have no recollection of this at all, but a school report found among my mother's papers when she died indicated that I was there for 2 terms, autumn 1934 and spring 1935. According to my teacher, one Margaret Duxbury, I had been much sought after as a companion by the other children, and had entered into all activities with zest. I had apparently used the occupational apparatus to good purpose, and had given evidence of intelligence and observation. It sounds like a good start for a scientist, or even a social scientist. Margaret Duxbury certainly thought I had made a special place for myself in the kindergarten, and Miss Gladys Mead, one of the principals, remembered me and, many years afterwards, used to ask my grandmother how I was getting on, though I don't remember ever meeting her. Kenneth, meanwhile, was again pursuing his career, and pirates along the China coast, showing the flag and protecting British interests, including the uncompleted naval base of Singapore. This base had been announced in 1923, but construction had been slow until 1931, when Japan invaded Manchuria. According to Brian Farrell, 1934 was an important year in the development of Japanese ambitions in China and in British planning, with almost inevitable consequences 8 years later. However, the only aggressive action recorded among Kenneth's photos is the rescue of 2 of Eagle's airmen from pirates, who seem to have been a problem in the great river deltas, where the presence of an aircraft carrier must have been a considerable asset to imperial power. At that date, the Royal Navy had only one purpose-built aircraft carrier, the small Hermes. Other carriers were converted from cruisers or a liner or, in the case of Eagle, the battleship Almirante Cochrane, being built for the Chilean government by Armstrong Whitworth when the beginning of World War I stopped work for the duration. She was bought by the British government in 1917, modified and then modified again, and finally commissioned in 1923. Because of her history, Eagle was larger than her contemporaries, but carried relatively few aircraft. Some 22,000 tons displacement with 18 aircraft, compared with Furious's 19,000 tons with 36 aircraft, or Hermes's 11,000 tons and 8 flights, which I take to be 24 aircraft. Although we have no letters or documentation other than many photos from this commission, we do have an insight into Kenneth's character. Stephen Roskill, a shipmate and friend who later became the official historian of the Royal Navy's part in World War II, wrote that Kenneth, as divisional officer in the Eagle, would offer to take to his own division sailors who had been punished, in order to give them a new start. Roskill wrote, "It was astonishing how successful he was, even with persistent offenders." Captain Wells of the Eagle was equally effusive about Kenneth's performance from March 1933 to April 1935. "He has conducted himself to my complete satisfaction, a most efficient, zealous and reliable officer of great ability, energy and judgment." On Kenneth's return, my parents rented a terrace house, 153 Victoria Road North, in Southsea, near the now demolished Plaza Cinema and Bradford Circus. The house belonged to a doctor, perhaps with his surgery on the ground floor. I have memories of this house, with the sitting room on the first floor and crowds streaming past to nearby Fratton Park on a Saturday afternoon. 153 Victoria Road North doesn't seem to exist anymore. I have some doubts as to when Kenneth received his brass hat, promotion to the rank of commander, carrying with it the row of gold oak leaves round the edge of his service cap. One document from the Naval Manning Agency gives the date as the 31st of December 1934, but his next appointment, on return to the UK and on promotion, was from June 1935. Presumably, there would have been a good spell of leave on returning from China to explain this gap. We were definitely living in Victoria Road North at the time of this promotion, as there is a photo of me, aged 4, proudly wearing his brass hat and holding his silver-headed stick in the back garden of that house. However, it was during 1935 that my parents bought Lumley Croft, and we moved there to our only permanent family home, which my mother only left in 1968 when she remarried. I have many memories of that period. Building a house with toy stone bricks, some of which survived until 2018, on the first night in the house when I couldn't get to sleep for the excitement. Helping my father dig up a row of laurel trees to widen the drive so that we could get a car to the new-built garage, wearing a black armband for the death of King George V, finding the gate at the end of the private road shut, even though we had right of ingress, egress, regress, etc. Luckily the farmer lived close to the gate. I don't know what my father said to him, but I think it only happened once. It was during this period that my mother's parents rented a house in Chelsea for a family holiday, including the grandparents, my parents, Jane and me, and also mother's sister Joyce and our cousin Jill Ransford. My memory of that holiday is mainly of my grandmother endlessly playing patience in the sitting room of the large bungalow. I think it must have been a traumatic time for my parents, and my mother once described it as a dreadful holiday, though she clearly didn't want to talk about it. Presumably she wanted to be alone with Kenneth, to readjust to life after the long separation, and to sort out their problems without interference from a large family group, some in the know and others to be kept in the dark. Having left Woodbrook Kindergarten at the end of the spring term 1935, at some point that year I started at another kindergarten or nursery school in Record Road, Emsworth. I have various half-memories of little consequence of that school. For example, of sitting on the floor and singing when a young fellow fell overboard among the sharks and whales. I wonder if that song started my interest in words, with its simple and effective pun. Record Road ended in open land in those days, with a footpath leading to the soon-to-be-extended Victoria Road and the railway station. I think I used to walk to school from Lumley Croft, because it was mostly across the fields, as we used to say, under a railway bridge, past the gas holder, across North Street near the station and along this semi-rural footpath as far as the end of Record Road. Mother collected me in the car on at least one occasion, because I remember that she had in the car the ship's bell, no doubt Navy surplus, which the family have had ever since, and which for many years found a place halfway up our stairs. Another family incident from early on at Lumley Croft brings my sister Jane back into the picture. On being put to bed one evening, aged perhaps 2 or 3, she suddenly asked where her money was. Inquiries revealed that she had found or been given a farthing coin, a quarter of an old penny, worth about 1/10 of a penny in today's money, and it had disappeared. Further inquiries suggested that she had had it in her mouth and might have swallowed it. She was rushed to the local hospital, the Victoria Cottage Hospital in Emsworth, and X-rays revealed the coin safely inside her. It was judged that nature would take its course and the coin would eventually return to daylight, so the emergency party returned home to bed. In the meantime, Jane had so enjoyed the experience and the fuss made of her at the hospital that the next night the same cry went up. She said she thought she had swallowed another coin. I don't think she was really believed, but the thought of her gradually becoming her own piggy bank was too risky for careful parents to tolerate, so back to hospital they went. The X-rays showed the original coin progressing nicely, but no new arrival to make the whole halfpence. The trick was not repeated a third time, but I wonder if this was the first experience that set Jane on her later nursing career. A few years later, when we were driving back on the old 2-lane A3 over Butser, at a place where there used to be a moderate S-bend, not far from where the Queen Elizabeth Country Park is now, we passed the scene of a traffic accident. A motorcyclist was laid out on the grass verge being attended to by a number of people. It wasn't clear what had happened, but he was motionless and possibly dead. We didn't stop, but all the way home Jane was singing cheerfully, "We're on our way to hospital." At that point, she clearly had identified the attractions to her of nursing. Kenneth's next appointment was as executive officer back at HMS Dryad. He was also ex officio in the command of the navigation school tender, HMS Alresford. This job was clearly a plum job for a navigator, and demonstrates the professional regard in which Kenneth was held. His captain at that time was Jack Spooner, and in his flimsy on that occasion, written on the 14th of January 1936, Captain Spooner said that Kenneth had conducted himself to my entire satisfaction and has carried out his duties in command of HMS Alresford and as executive officer on HMS Dryad with outstanding ability. It must have been during this period, 1935 to 1937, that some other events occurred which I dimly remember. One was being taken to Southampton to see the newly fitted out liner RMS Queen Mary, alongside a vast ship of which all I can remember is the towering black side and a vague idea of funnels somewhere up in the sky. Perhaps she was about to start on her maiden voyage, but I don't have a picture of any milling crowds or passengers. Another memory is of the Schneider trophy race, won by a supermarine seaplane, an early prototype for the famous Spitfire fighter plane of World War II. I don't recall actually seeing the race or the winner, but I know there was a lot of talk about it and my parents were very interested. I do remember watching aeroplanes, as they were called in those days, biplanes mostly, flying over Lumley Croft, glimpsed through the apple trees against a clear blue sky, as I lay on my back on the lawn. Such peace. Another recollection of this period was being taken to visit the Royal Yacht in Portsmouth. This was the old HMY Victoria and Albert, built in 1899 and in service until the Britannia succeeded her post-World War II. In appearance, the Victoria and Albert was very yacht-like, with a curved bow leading out to a long bowsprit and an overhanging stern. In fact, not unlike a smaller, more elegant version of HMS Warrior, 1864, having 3 masts, though they were clearly designed for signal flags and bunting rather than for sails, as well as 2 funnels. It occurs to me as I write this that the time interval between Warrior and the Victoria and Albert was only a couple of years longer than the interval between the latter and the Nelson. I remember very little of the ship, except sitting on someone's bunk and being offered a chocolate biscuit or some similar delight suitable for a small boy. Another old ship I remember seeing about this time, from the front in the South Sea, was the last surviving 3-funnel destroyer in the Navy, HMS Skate, launched in 1917. I was on the front at Southsea when my father and we played a fairground slot machine which involved navigating a small ship into or out of harbour. I think we both ran it aground. This appointment to Dryad lasted less than a year before Kenneth went on the Naval Staff Course at Greenwich. This occupied the whole of the year of 1936 from January to December. Presumably the family were at Lumley Croft, but we certainly spent some time at Molly's parents' home in Beckenham, because it was there that I remember watching from my top-floor bedroom window a great fire that was the Crystal Palace burning down. Molly and her brother Terence, thought the fire was just around the corner and went out to watch. They ended up running most of the way to the Crystal Palace, which I reckon was about 2 miles from Elm Road, and much of it uphill. Meanwhile, I watched the glow from the window of my little bedroom at the back of the house, just below the attics which faced directly towards the fire. The date of the fire was the 30th of November 1936, when I was 6 years old. Ted was the closest in age to Molly of her 3 siblings, and her best friends when they were young. She used to tell a story about Ted hiding with her when they were both much younger, under the heavily draped dining table at their home, and cutting off all her hair to surprise their mother. Reading again Kenneth's record of service, I found one more incident that I do remember clearly. On the 26th of February 1936, he was admitted to Cambridge Military Hospital in Aldershot with an injury to his mouth. This was an occasion when he was playing hockey for the Royal Navy against the Army and was hit by a ball that knocked out his 2 front teeth. I remember visiting him in hospital, where he joked that the worst bit was the ignominy for a member of the senior service in having to suffer in an army hospital. In fact, I believe he had a high regard for the professional army. This was probably the last time he played hockey for the Navy. I think it may have been later in 1936 that my parents took me to the Folkestone Hockey Festival, where we lived in a caravan on the cliffs outside the town for the week, with me proudly wearing my new sailor's uniform, fancy dress, but made to measure and correct in every detail. I remember discussing what rate I should have, thinking torpedo gunner's mate had a good ring to it, but being told that I had to start at the bottom as a junior signalman. Kenneth's intermittent hockey career for the Navy had started in 1922, when he was strongly tipped for a place in the final England trial, having shone in previous trials both for the Royal Navy and the Combined Services. His fine dash, speed, stickwork, and general control of the ball when doing the wing sprint against Cambridge University at Beckenham recently have caused 1 or 2 of us to elevate our eyebrows and say, "Who's this young fellow?" is just one of the comments from the contemporary publications. Unfortunately, the family story goes, he injured himself playing football shortly before that final trial, so was not available for selection and never had another chance. His photos of the Eagle Commission show that he had played much hockey and cricket for ship's teams in many scattered places in the East when he was not at home. He was also a keen golfer and tried to persuade Molly to take up the sport, which I think she never really enjoyed. I remember at least once, sometime in my early life, having a cold ham salad sandwich with my parents at a golf club. The ham was one of the best meals I had ever tasted. Perhaps it was on a similar occasion that I developed a liking for sausages, which was later dimmed by the wartime apology for a sausage, only to be revived recently by the discovery of gluten-free sausages, the ordinary ones having only recently recovered, in my view, from wartime economies. Kenneth's next appointment, from the 20th of December 1936, was as navigator of the heavy cruiser London, and as squadron navigating officer, the London being the flagship of the 1st Cruiser Squadron in the Mediterranean, HM ships London, Devonshire, Shropshire and Sussex. My earliest memory of HMS London was at King George VI Coronation Review of the Fleet at Spithead in early summer 1937. This was the occasion when the BBC's commentator was overcome by naval hospitality to the extent that he was unable to describe the fleet's firework display except by awed and increasingly slurred repetition of the phrase, "The fleet's all lit up." I wasn't aware of that at the time, but I do remember being taken aboard London and resting in my father's sea cabin until it was time to watch the fireworks. I don't remember the fireworks at all, though I have images, perhaps from newspaper photos, of the ship silhouetted in lights after nightfall, or all lit up, to use the commentator's phrase. Afterwards I was taken home and went to bed at 1 a.m, exhausted, but excited at the privilege of being allowed to stay up until that unheard-of hour. Kenneth was given the Coronation Medal to join his King George V Silver Jubilee Medal and his 2 World War I medals. On Kenneth's posting to the London in the Mediterranean, he and Molly were determined not to be separated for so long as they had been in 1933 to 35. Molly went out to Malta for a visit during the summer of 1937, while Jane and I went to stay with the family of the Norlands nursery nurse, Dorothy Rotten, at St. Neots. I always understood that her father was rector of St. Neots, but when Janet and I went to look for the rectory a few years ago, we found that there was no such place. I remembered the building quite well, from the pump outside the kitchen door to draw up water from a working well, to the large bedroom I had to myself, looking out over the fields at the back of the house. St. Neots has an old vicarage, which is in the middle of the town and clearly not the building I remember, so we set out to cross the river to look at the old rectory, Amesbury. From the meadows we could see that this was almost certainly the building I was looking for, and still apparently in occupation, though it was difficult to see what sort of occupation. The church was closed, so we couldn't confirm the name Rotten on the list of the past rectors. I couldn't see the old pump, and the building seemed to be further from the road than my memory of some 70 years earlier had placed it. There was also more enclosure of land at the back than I was aware of when I watched cows through the rector's brass table-mounted astronomical telescope, wandering upside down across the open meadows towards the river. I am sure this was the house where Jane and I stayed in 1937. A letter to Ken's sister Violet, written from Patras in Greece and dated the 11th of September 1937, has survived. He describes London's visit to Venice, the partying and late nights, or early mornings, returns on board, which seemed to have outdone the world cruise. He met many famous people, Marlene Dietrich, Anna Neagle, international financiers, politicians, artists and authors, more famous people than he had ever heard of. The real success of the visit for him was an American girl who introduced him to the house where she was staying. the Abbazio di San Gregorio, the oldest and smallest palace in Venice. Ken doesn't mention her name in this letter, but it must be the lady who offered us a home in the States for the duration a few years later. In the autumn of 1937, Molly, Jane and I set off from Tilbury Docks for Malta aboard the P&O liner Ranchi. A large-scale model of the Ranchi's sister ship is in the Discovery Museum in Newcastle, as is one of HMS Nelson, both ships having been built on the Tyne. Molly's parents came to see us off and had lunch on board before departure. I remember watching the ship's wake, a straight road of turbulence behind us, and thinking this was a most exciting moment. I have often watched ships' wakes and bow waves since and marvelled at the infinite variation of the same general patterns, manifestations no doubt of chaotic forces. We called at Plymouth, Tangier and Marseille on the way out. Approaching Tangier, I wondered if I would see a lion, that being the coast of Africa, and I knew that lions lived in Africa. But we were a long way from the mountains, and wasn't the last lion in North Africa shot in the 1920s? Passing through the Straits of Gibraltar, a couple of British destroyers came out to escort us into the dangerous waters of the Mediterranean. The Spanish Civil War being in progress and hostile submarines being more of a danger than lions. I didn't know it at the time, but the Royal Navy was blockading the Spanish coast in order to prevent the powerful Italian Navy from giving aid to Franco, in the same way that the fascist powers were helping him on land and in the air. I was too young at the time to appreciate the Spanish Republican view that the Royal Navy should have been actively helping them, as so many volunteers were doing in the International Brigade. No doubt we were not yet ready for the war that so many seemed to have known was inevitable. The sight of the two destroyers was exciting and comforting, though they were genuinely in some danger, as witnessed the fate of their sister ship HMS Hunter. In Marseille we went ashore and visited the zoo, which I don't really remember, except as an impression of heat and dust and suffering, but whether that was the animals or us, or both, I don't know. I do remember looking down on the city from a nearby hill, so we must have had a few hours ashore. After arriving in Malta, we stayed for a night or two at the Phoenicia Hotel, with suffocating mosquito nets on our beds and a lemon tree and fruit outside our ground floor bedroom window. Our permanent home was at number 2 Miranda Flats, 139 Tower Road, in Sliema, facing the sea. The layout of the main rooms is etched forever in my memory. The sitting room with a veranda and our parents' bedroom took up the front of the flat, with a corridor leading to the back, past a small lobby and the front door on the right. On the left, between the light wells, were the dining room, bathroom, my bedroom and the nursery, which led on to another veranda overlooking a rather forlorn and dusty garden. Since we were on the first floor, we had no access to the garden, nor would particularly have wanted any. The dining room had doors to the corridor at either end, and my bedroom also had 2 doors, which allowed for wonderful circuits for my cycle, though I don't remember that cycling around the flat was encouraged by my parents. We lived in this flat for about 9 months, roughly September 1937 to June 1938, and some of the time I slept on the balcony at the front, presumably to benefit from the cooling sea breezes. Mosquito nets were impractical on the balcony, and as far as I remember, we never used them in the flat either. Instead, we had slow-burning coils to ward off insects, though I have no recollection of the mosquitoes being particularly bothersome, a favourite word of my mother's family. Dorothy Rotten had declined to come with us to Malta, and her place was taken by Marion, a young and relatively untrained nursemaid, promoted from kitchen maid. Marion relished the adventure of going abroad, in days when foreign travel was relatively rare, except for working servants of the Empire, or the very rich. She was very willing to take me roller skating at a rink along the coast, where she had an assignation with a sailor from one of the light cruisers, Pluto or Neptune, sister ships to the Ajax and Achilles, famous a few years later for their part in the Battle of the River Plate. The reader will be aware by now that I had an encyclopedic knowledge of the ships of the Royal Navy, which at that age I found more interesting than people. I have a feeling that Marion also found congenial the company of my father's Royal Marine servant, who lived aboard the London, but came to the flat to act as butler or waiter when there was a formal dinner party. I was strictly confined to quarters on these occasions, but liked to get up early the next morning to sample the exotic leftovers, though in general I wasn't too keen on new foods. I remember one day when I was given brains and artichokes as the same meal for the first time, a double horror which I would still avoid. The other living-in member of the household was the Maltese cook, kitchen maid, Giuseppa, who had her own tiny wedge-shaped bedroom off the kitchen. Wedge-shaped, as my mother said, by the Maltese architect to fit with a similar room at the next block and minimize the space wasted on the servants. Molly felt sorry for Giuseppa in her cramped quarters. She was very good-hearted and wonderful with Jane, I believe. As for me, I deeply resented her way of showing affection by picking me up and nibbling the lobe of my ear. For a short while there was a seventh resident who lived on the balcony at the back of our flat. The London had been on a visit to Alexandria as part of its showing the flag roll. Egypt was a nominally independent, reasonably friendly state, vital to us in the defence of the Suez Canal, still owned by the Anglo-French Suez Canal Company, and the short sea route to India and the Far East. The canal was also directly between Mussolini and the brutal colonial war in Abyssinia, modern Ethiopia, which he was waging at that time. Somehow, among all this flag-showing and high drama, London acquired a tortoise. The sailors painted its shell with broad traverse red, white and blue stripes to match the stripes painted on London's B turret of twin 8-inch guns, as with all major British warships in the Mediterranean at that time, to identify their nationality from the air. The tortoise, properly identified as a British tortoise, apparently lived on the bridge until the ship returned to Malta, when it took up residence on our balcony. I had a perfectly good hutch and plenty of food and water, but whether it was the sight of the shrubby garden 1 floor below, or the fact that Giuseppa, contrary to strict instructions, persisted in turning the poor thing on its back, making it quite helpless until rescued, I don't know, but it very soon hurled itself down into the garden. Returned upstairs, apparently undamaged, it repeated its flight the next day, again unhurt, but not wishing to risk further suicide attempts, my parents entered into negotiations with the more senior officer in the ground floor flat for the tortoise to be transferred to their care. My recollection is that this officer's name was Forbes, and he was not well pleased. It only occurred to me recently to wonder if he was the same Forbes who later became Commander-in-Chief Home Fleet, carrying his flag in Nelson when Kenneth was executive officer of that ship in 1938 to 1940, and who is thought to have blocked Kenneth's promotion to captain in July 1940, with all the consequences that followed from that, forming the later chapters of this story. Of course, it may not have been the same Forbes, and my recollection of the name may indeed be faulty, but it is an intriguing possibility. Admiral Charles Forbes was second in command of the Mediterranean Fleet in 1937, and would have been 57 years old, and so suitably senior to be treated with the utmost respect by a mere commander of 35, whose children may or may not have caused disturbance, cycling and running about above the Admiral's head, while he was trying to relax after wrestling with the serious naval and political crises of the day. Was that tortoise the butterfly that flapped its non-existent wings between numbers 1 and 2 Miranda Flats, and started the chain of events that led, for my father, to the naval and political chaos of Singapore, which was also woefully short of effective wings? Despite the 2 wars being fought in the region, Malta seemed to me to be very peaceful. Social activities went on normally, with children's parties aboard battleships, and swimming in the sea, and visits to various parts of the island. The Royal Navy did a good party in those days. From the trip out to the Queen Elizabeth, or the Barham, sister ships to the more famous Warspite, though, unlike the latter, not modernized, in a steam pinnace, with a tall, highly polished brass funnel, to the welcome on board by a gang of sailors dressed as pirates, who fed the trembling children into a tubular canvas chute to slide down to a dark cave on the lower deck, where more bloodthirsty pirates carefully caught the victims before administering other terrifying threats, followed no doubt by jelly and ice cream. Among visits, I remember her prehistoric site, which I later, in 2016, learnt was Tarxian. We went there with Brenda Ellaby, who had run a brownie pack with Molly in Hong Kong, and whose job was chauffeur to the head of Huntley and Palmer, the biscuit firm, an amazing job for a woman in the 1930s. Perhaps she was also secretary or PA. Another visit was to a cottage weaving enterprise, my first introduction to the textile industry. I came away from that with a pink table napkin, which survived for many years in my possession and well into our married life. I knew very little of Father's work during this time, though it must have been a stressful time for the Navy, with the Spanish War and the Abyssinian crisis in full swing. I knew that my parents read Stephen King Hall's newsletter and took a close interest in world affairs. Looking back, I recall an occasion when I jumped out at my father from behind some sort of buttress in the corridor of our flat. He told me off in surprisingly stern terms for a dangerous trick, and I guess his reaction was natural from someone under a certain amount of stress. On one occasion there was a defense exercise on the island with a heavy machine gun on a tripod mounted on the seafront near our flat, in full view of any attempted landing. Even as a 7-year-old, I wondered why no attempt had been made to hide the weapon. Perhaps the main purpose was to reassure the civilian population there would have been little use against the air attacks that were to come a few years later. On another occasion, I had the thrill of being taken to sea aboard the London. It was a bright, sunny day, and I was allowed to stand behind the team on the open upper bridge from which the ship was being driven. Unfortunately, orders came through during the day for some change of plan, which meant I had to be landed in a hurry at the Navy's seaplane base and taken home to Sliema by car. This drive was perhaps an even greater thrill than the sea trip, as the midshipman detailed to take me home owned a small open-top sports car, and on the way we touched 60 miles an hour for the first time in my life. Today in the UK that would be quite unremarkable, dawdling perhaps, but I guess that on the Maltese roads of the 1930s it was almost suicidal. I don't remember being at all frightened, but then I trusted the midshipmen implicitly as the chosen people whose ranks I hoped to join in due course. Another snotty was the naval slang for midshipman, but of course I wouldn't be so disrespectful, once explained to me, quite wrongly, why a reef knot was so called. I believe his error, or leg pull, for years. One of the midshipmen in the London was the third Marquess of Milvan Haven, born in 1919, who only succeeded to the title on the death of his father in April 1938. I do remember my mother being very interested in the title and the holder's recent elevation, he having only been Earl of Modena before his father's death. He was a cousin of Prince Philip and, like him, a nephew of Earl Mountbatten. On one occasion we, my parents, the Marquess, and perhaps another mid, went for a picnic in a hired Maltese rowing boat with a Maltese oarsman. It was a good story to tell later at school, but all I really remember of the picnic was learning to coil and throw a rope's end and, possibly on that occasion too, to coil a rope down in the proper tiddly, neat way in the bottom of the boat. A good way of occupying a tiresome lad who keeps annoying the oarsman by throwing the rope over the side and getting it entangled with an oar. One day my father took me to see the remains of HMS Hunter in dry dock. I clearly remember, as a wide-eyed 7-year-old, standing on the edge of the dry dock and looking down at this little wreck of a ship, 1,335 tons displacement, and seeing the bottom of the dock through the hole. I sometimes wonder if I am the youngest person to have seen it in this state. The story is of great interest to me for two reasons. Firstly, having actually seen her, with a great gaping hole through the bottom of the ship as she lay in dry dock in Malta in 1938, and then, some 60 years later, discovering that Kenneth and Brian Scurfield, the Hunter's captain, had served together in the Petersfield in 1929. In Malta we became very familiar with the sight of Hunter's sister ships of the 2nd Destroyer Flotilla, and the other 2 flotillas of modern destroyers moored in the creek round the corner from us at Sliema, with the light cruiser Galatea carrying the captain destroyers. These were 27 of the most modern ships of their class, but the strength of their construction didn't save the majority of them from being lost during World War II. I believe that my favourite, because I learnt its pennant number H01, HMS Hotspur, was the only one of the flotilla to survive. The Hunter was repaired and was able to rejoin the fleet in October 1938, by which time I was back at school in England, and Kenneth was settling into his next job in HMS Nelson. Brian Scurfield was awarded the Albert Medal for his life-saving work in the Hunter disaster, and later was awarded OBE and DSE during World War II, where he was captured by the Germans and sadly died of the wounds sustained in an Allied bombing raid on his POW camp. The only sporting recollection I have of my father in Malta was of him winning the veterans' race on a sports day, which, I guess from the size of the occasion, was fleet, or at least squadron, rather than the ship's sports. My impression of it was that it was a 100-yard race, and since Kenneth would have been at least 35 at the time, that age was presumably the definition of a veteran. Other random memories of Malta, before we returned to England and started to look for a boarding school for me, include school at Chiswick House School, with at least 2 daughters of other naval officers, whom I can recognise from the school photo. Jill Shepherd, with whom I sometimes walked home along the rocks between school and our flat, and whose father was Major D.A.C. Shepherd, Royal Marines, Naval Provost, Marshal Malta. Not that I knew that at the time. I just knew he was a Marine officer. The other friend's first name I have forgotten, but she was the daughter of the London's chief engineer, Commander E. B.W.G. Clutterbuck. I also remember Tim Phillips, whose father was an electrical branch officer and later became a Rear Admiral L. Tim collected tin, lead soldiers, and I was briefly interested, but much less so than in my fleet of dinky toy warships, which I manoeuvred on the sitting-room floor with an appropriate screen of scouting cruisers, though the size of my fleet never matched my tactical ambitions. At this age I was still assuming I would go to Dartmouth and join the Navy at 13. I remember Mother's insistence on dried milk because the standard Maltese milk delivery was direct from a goat into a jug on the doorstep, doubtfully hygienic and decreed not to our taste. Above all, I remember the various places where I swam in the sea, mostly off rocks and well out of my depth, but supremely confident with a rubber ring to keep me afloat, even when swimming out to the raft at the club in Sliema. There was one sandy beach on the far side of the island, Gan Tafria, where we went, possibly on our last weekend on the island, because I associate it with a school friend, possibly Miss Clutterbuck, asking if I had remembered my shilling for the school trip the next week. I had to tell her we were going home before the trip, so didn't need a shilling. One of my last acts before we left the island aboard another P&O liner, the SS Comorin, was to set my toy yacht adrift on the Mediterranean. It was a beautiful vessel, with 2 masts and brown sails, which I had brought out new from England. It lived beside my bed at Lumley Croft until it took to the waters of the Med, but, truth to tell, it was always in danger of escaping, and I think I thought it deserved its freedom and good luck to any Maltese lad who found it and cherished it. One of the few gramophone records my parents had at Lumley Croft was the song Red Sails in the Sunset, and I think I felt a romanticism of the song transferred to the brown sails of my toy, although it gained its freedom in full daylight and probably ran ashore again within a few yards of its launching. I didn't wait to see. The journey home was memorable for only one event. Shortly before leaving Malta, I had trodden on a sea urchin. At least I think that's what it was called. A black, round creature covered in spines, and looking rather like a sweet chestnut apart from its colour. My foot was very painful, and my mother spent some time each day pulling the spines out with tweezers. I can't imagine that I spent much time running round the ship, but after lunch each day Jane and I were left in our cabin resting, as was the family habit. Children's lunch was served first, so as to enable the adults to tackle the lavish menu undisturbed. One day we were resting as usual, but I decided to climb down from my top bunk and, handicapped by my foot, I got stuck with the leg of my shorts hooked over the top of the ladder, unable to go either up or down. Jane was persuaded to run to the dining saloon and find Mummy. She found the room, which in itself was quite an achievement at not yet 5 years old, but from near deck level was quite unable to spot her mother in the large room, with perhaps several hundred other adults, so she gave a plaintive call and ran back to the cabin. I was still suspended between deck and deckhead, and rather cross that she had only partly accomplished her task. However, acute hearing, or some sixth sense, had alerted our mother that the faintest whisper of the word mummy in the babble of adult conversation had been Jane, and I was soon rescued from my ignominious position.